Warren Doss heard the mare before he saw her. 3 sharp strikes of a hoof against packed dirt, then a pause, then 3 more, steady as a man knocking on a door, who already knows nobody's going to answer. He stepped out of the barn with a bucket still in his hand and found her exactly where she'd been the last 2 mornings, standing broadside to the old hollow walnut at the fence corner, ears pinned forward, pawing at the same 6 inches of ground like she meant to dig her way to Texas. "Clem," he said, "that tree's not going anywhere." The mare didn't so much as flick an ear at him. 24 years old, swayback now, gray coming in heavy around her muzzle, and she was acting like a 2-year-old who'd spotted a rattlesnake. Warren set the bucket down and studied the tree the way he'd studied it 1,000 times before. A black walnut, maybe 5 feet through at the base, half its bark long gone to gray, with a hollow at the bottom big enough to put your arm into up to the shoulder. His father had called it the line tree. Nobody had touched it in 60 years. He figured raccoons. Told himself that, and went back to his coffee. By the 3rd morning, he wasn't so sure. She hadn't missed a single day, and each time she picked the same patch of ground at the base of that same tree, like she was standing guard over something only she could sense. If you've ever had an old animal try to tell you something you couldn't quite make sense of, you know the feeling that was starting to sit in Warren's chest, that itch of a question with no good answer yet. Stick around, because this old mare wasn't wrong. Warren Doss was 67 years old and had farmed the same 140 acres outside Licking, Missouri, since his father handed him the deed, and not long after, a heart attack took him before either of them expected it. Warren had never married. There'd been a woman once, back in his 30s, but the farm didn't leave much room for anything that wasn't cattle, hay, or fence line, and she'd made her peace with that by leaving. He didn't blame her. He'd made his peace with a lot of things by working through them instead of talking about them, which was maybe not the healthiest way to live, but it was the only way he knew. His days ran on a short list of habits he rarely broke. Up before light, coffee on the stove while he pulled on his boots, then out to feed before the sun cleared the tree line. 22 head of cattle, a garden he kept mostly out of stubbornness and Clem, who hadn't earned her keep in the traditional sense for the better part of a decade, but who Warren wasn't about to sell off, just because she'd gotten old and slow. A man who farms alone gets particular about the animals that stick around that long. They start to feel less like livestock and more like the only regular conversation he has, even if the conversation only ever runs one direction. The back pasture where the walnut stood was the farthest corner from the house, a stretch of ground his father had always been oddly protective of. Warren remembered being a boy and getting scolded, more sharply than the offense seemed to call for chucking rocks at squirrels near that tree. At the time, he'd chalked it up to his father just being particular about a nice old walnut. It hadn't occurred to him, not once in 40 years, that there might have been a different reason. Clementine, Clem to anyone who mattered, had come to the farm as a yearling the same spring Warren turned 19. His father broke her to harness first, then let Warren take over once the old man's hands got too stiff to hold reins properly. She pulled a plow, then a wagon, then not much of anything for the last 8 years, except her own weight around the pasture, retired and fat, and until 3 days ago, about as predictable as the sunrise. Warren didn't put much stock in mystery. A man who farms alone learns to distrust anything he can't explain, because unexplained things on a farm usually cost money. So on the 4th morning, when Clem was back at the walnut again, pawing, blowing air out through her nose in short, irritated bursts, he walked over and actually looked. The hollow smelled different than it used to. Not bad, Not rot exactly, but musky and faintly sharp, the kind of smell a den gets when something's been using it a while, layered under the normal smell of wet bark and mushroom in years. He crouched down, put his hand into the opening, felt around the rough inside walls. Nothing but soft, punky wood and a scatter of walnut shells some squirrel had been cracking for a winter cache. Though low in a crack near the bottom, his fingers brushed a scatter of something small and dry he didn't think much of at the time. He straightened up, wiped his hand on his jeans, and looked at Clem. She looked back at him with that particular flat, patient stare horses give you when they're waiting for you to catch up. "Fine," he said. "I'll figure it out." That afternoon, he found the tracks. Raccoon, sure, a few of those. But also something heavier. Deer, maybe, pressed into the soft ground at the base of the tree. And underneath a low branch, a patch of bark rubbed clean and shiny, like something had been scratching against it for a good long while. He also noticed, for the first time in years, the old blaze mark cut high on the trunk, a healed-over scar shaped like a shallow arrow, pointing due south along the fence line. His father used to call this the line tree because it marked the corner of the original homestead survey, back when Warren's grandfather first fenced the place in 1949. Warren had grown up hearing that name and never once asked what it meant beyond a boundary post that happened to be a tree instead of a stake. He walked the fence line for a good 20 minutes after that, tapping the trunk with the flat of his hand every few feet, the way his father had taught him to check a tree before deciding whether it was worth the trouble of felling. Solid wood gave back a dull, close sound. Hollow wood rang a little, thin and hollow-chested, like knocking on an empty barrel. By the time he'd worked his way around the base, he'd found that the hollow ran deeper into the trunk than he'd ever guessed. Not just the opening at the bottom, but a long, rotted core running up a good 6 feet inside a shell of live wood that was, by all outward appearances, perfectly healthy. It was the kind of tree an inexperienced man might cut down without a second thought and get badly hurt doing it. He was still standing there working it over when his neighbor, Dale Ashworth, pulled up along the fence road in his truck, window down, elbow resting on the frame the way it always was. "Your mare giving you trouble," Dale called out. "Something's got her stirred up about this tree," Warren said. 3 days running. Dale squinted at the walnut like he was trying to remember something. "That's the one your daddy used to walk out to every spring, isn't it? I remember my own daddy saying something about a survey argument way back. Before my time, mostly." "Survey argument," Warren repeated. "Ask your Aunt Ruth, if she's still sharp enough." She was. Warren drove into town that evening and sat with his 89-year-old aunt on her porch, and she told him, slow, with a lot of pauses to get the details straight, that back in the 50s there'd been a dispute between Warren's grandfather and the Ashworth family over exactly where the property line ran through the bottomland. The county surveyor at the time had made an error, shifting the line nearly half an acre onto Ashworth ground without either family quite realizing it for years. Warren's father found out about it decades later, going through old paperwork, and it had eaten at him. The idea that his family had been farming ground that by rights wasn't theirs. "He never told the Ashworths," Ruth said. "Never told nobody, far as I know. Guilt does funny things to a proud man. Why not just fix it then? Move the fence, tell him, be done with it." Ruth gave him a look that had more patience in it than he probably deserved. "Because fixing it meant admitting his own daddy did wrong, and your father worshipped the ground your grandfather walked on. Some men will carry a wrong a long time, rather than speak ill of the dead, even to make it right." He used to walk out to that tree every spring, you know. I always figured he was just checking his fence. Maybe he was checking his conscience instead. Warren drove home in the dark, thinking about a father he'd known for 41 years, and apparently hadn't known at all. We're a little past the halfway point here. And if you're the kind of person who likes figuring things out alongside the story instead of skipping to the end, drop where you think this is headed in the comments. I'd bet more of you are close than you think. The next. Morning Clem was back at the tree, and this time, Warren didn't tell her to move along. He got the ladder from the shed and climbed up to where the trunk widened. And that's when he found it, a second opening, higher up, hidden behind a curtain of ivy, big enough to slide a hand and forearm through, but no farther. Something metal clinked when he brushed against it. He couldn't reach it, not without cutting. That was the complication, and it was a real one. The walnut was old and mostly hollow through the lower third of the trunk, which meant the tree wasn't just standing on habit and stubbornness the way it looked. Cutting wrong could bring the whole crown down, and a black walnut that size, even half-rotted, still weighed more than most men wanted to guess wrong about. Warren spent 2 days just walking around it, tapping the bark with the back of an axe, listening for the difference between solid wood and hollow, marking a rough map in his head of where the shell was thick enough to trust and where it wasn't. On the 6th day, Warren finally cut, not the whole tree, just a careful notch below the second opening, angled to open a window into the hollow without touching the load-bearing wood higher up. He worked slow with a handsaw instead of the chainsaw, because a chainsaw doesn't know the difference between rotten wood and a hidden object, and he wasn't about to shred whatever was in there before he even saw it. Clem stood 20 feet off the whole time, watching, quiet for once, like she understood the difference between pawing at a door and someone finally opening it. The notch came free in one piece. Inside, wedged into a hollow that had clearly been carved out on purpose decades before nature ever got around to widening it, sat a rusted tin toolbox wrapped in the rotted remains of a canvas feed sack, and packed in against it, tucked into the loose folds of that same rotted canvas, was a mouse nest, fresh, still warm, a tight ball of shredded cloth and dry grass, with a scatter of tiny black droppings around the edge. Warren understood then, all at once, why Clem had been drawn to this tree and no other. Deer mice had been denning against that tin box for who knew how many seasons, coming and going through the crack he'd felt with his fingers days before. And a mare's nose and ears were built for exactly that kind of thing. The rustle and must of small living creatures working away inside a hollow at ground level, close enough for her to hear what Warren never could. She hadn't understood what was in the tree. She'd only ever known something alive was in there, and that had been more than enough to keep her coming back. Before you go, if a story like this one is the kind you'd want waiting in your feed next time, the quiet kind, the kind about doing right by people because it's right and not because anyone's watching, sticking around the channel and hitting that subscribe button helps more of these find their way to you. Because what Warren found inside that tin box was about to turn the tree from a mystery into something a whole lot heavier. Inside the tin box, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the damp mostly out, Warren found his father's handwriting, a ledger, water-stained at the edges but legible, detailing years of crop yields, cattle counts, and weather notes, and tucked into the back, folded twice, an old surveyor's plat map with a corrected boundary line drawn in pencil, and beneath it a short note in his father's careful hand. Tell the Ashworths. Don't let this die with me the way it near did with Pa. He hadn't told them. He died with the truth still folded up in a hollow tree, meaning to make it right and running out of time before he could. Warren sat down right there in the grass with the tin box in his lap for a long while. He wasn't an emotional man by habit, but something about holding proof of his father's guilt and his father's intention to fix it, both at once, in the same shaking piece of paper, got to him in a way little else had since the funeral. He drove to the Ashworth place the next morning. Dale met him at the door, and Warren didn't waste time on the story working up slow. He just handed over the plat map and the ledger and told him what his aunt had said, and what the tree had been hiding for 60 years. Dale read it twice, quiet, and then looked out toward the fence line the two families had shared their whole lives without either one fully understanding what it meant. "Half an acre," Dale said finally. "That's not going to change my life, Warren." "It might change how I sleep," Warren said. They walked the line together that weekend with a surveyor Warren hired out of his own pocket, and when the paperwork was done, the fence moved 12 feet onto Doss ground, the way it always should have run. Neither man made a show of it. They shook hands at the new corner post, and Dale said something about how his daddy would have liked to see it settled, and Warren said his would too. And that was about all the ceremony either family needed. Dale's wife sent over a pie the following week, which Warren figured was the closest thing to a formal thank you either family was ever going to manage, and the two men fell into the habit of leaning on that same stretch of fence some evenings, talking about nothing in particular, the way neighbors do once an old debt stops sitting between them. It wasn't a friendship that changed either man's life in any dramatic way. It was just easier now, the kind of easier that comes from not carrying something you didn't even know you were carrying. The walnut is still standing. Warren sealed the notch with wood putty to keep the weather out and left the rest of the tree as it was, hollow and all, because taking it down now felt like erasing the very thing that had finally told the truth. Some mornings Clem still walks over to stand beside it, though she doesn't paw at it anymore. She just stands there a while, the way old animals do at places that used to matter more than they do now. And then she wanders off to graze like nothing ever happened at all. Warren figures she already knew there was nothing left in there worth digging for. She'd only ever been asking him to look. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments what you'd have done in Warren's place. And if you want more quiet, true-feeling stories like this one, Old Farmer Jack will be here waiting for you next time.